In perhaps one of the most horrifying documented instances in recent history of childhood neglect is the case of Lacey Fletcher. This case is one of travesty, malice, and an overall lack of empathy for their own flesh and blood. Because when diving into this case, we truly do get a glimpse of the horrifying underbelly of what humans are capable of when they let go of all sense of morality. What happens when you forego all morals in the name of selfishness. Because the worst part about this case is that this didn't happen in a day. This behavior, which led to the unfortunate discovering of Lacey Fletcher's body in 2022, happened over a 12-year period, starting back in 2010, the day Lacey first sat down on this couch. Hey everyone, it's Wildman, and in today's video we are going to be diving into the horrifying case of Lacey Fletcher. And before we start this video out, I do want to give out a disclaimer right now, because this is one of the most horrifying true crime cases that I've stumbled across. It's honestly a case that really does keep me up at night, a case that truly represents how heartless and cruel human beings can be. But to truly understand the events that led up to that fateful 911 call, we need to return to Lacey's origins. Lacey Ellen Fletcher was born on a Monday, November 25th, 1985. She was born with autism and had social anxiety as well. To her teachers, Lacey was always a delight to have in the classroom. Quote, Lacey was precious and a wonderful spirit. She had the most beautiful blue eyes and the most precious smile. I am absolutely heartbroken. She was gentle and sweet and loving, and she deserved to be loved. There is no excuse for what happened. None. Lowell Howell, the person that talked to the Post, also recalls a meeting with Lacey's mother, named Shayla Fletcher, when her daughter was in her classroom. Though she did note that you could tell that there was something off about the mother and the way that she kind of acted toward her child. Almost like she was in denial that her daughter had autism and in denial that her daughter needed that extra hand when it came to her studies. And so years would pass, and Lacey would eventually enter her freshman year of high school. The bright-eyed, once smiling student would join the volleyball team at Brownsfield Baptist Academy in Louisiana. But as she was pursuing her academics and now a venture into sports, it was reported that Lacey would begin to face bullying from her fellow classmates. And this is where the details of the case do get a bit murky, as it's unclear if the bullying was the reason that Lacey was subsequently pulled out of school. But regardless, when Lacey was 16, her parents Shayla and Clay Fletcher pulled Lacey from school in favor of homeschooling. Which at this point, with the denial of Lacey's mother acting like her daughter didn't need that extra hand and pretty much denying that her kid had autism, it was strange that the parents would opt in for homeschooling, as they were already known to complain about caring for their daughter, saying that when they first had their kid, they didn't expect to be, quote, caretakers when they became parents to Lacey. The downfall. In 2002, when Lacey was pulled from school, she would pretty much disappear from the public eye. Years would go by and no one would even question where Lacey had gone, which in itself is incredibly strange and something we'll touch on a bit later in this video. It is incredibly baffling that no one thought to wonder where Lacey Fletcher had gone after being pulled from school in 2002, as she would go 2 decades without anyone seeing her. Lacey's homeschooling following her being pulled from school is never spoken about, nor are there any articles detailing what that might have been like. But based on the actions of her parents when they pulled her from school and how they treated her later on in this case, it's pretty safe to assume that the homeschooling the parents had promised the district that they would give Lacey never happened, because caring for Lacey was already too much for the parents to handle. God forbid they try and educate her. Even more time would pass, with Lacey just being at home for pretty much her entire life. She'd eventually turn 24 in 2010. In that year, she would face a severe decline in her cognitive health, which led her unable to leave the house. She became unmotivated, still, and perhaps depressed though that is not explicitly mentioned in reports. A life left unfulfilled, now confined to the four walls that surround her. This is when Lacy sat on the couch. Days and weeks would go by, and Lacy would not leave the couch. And instead of trying to help her up, Shayla, her mother, placed towels next to her so that when she would defecate on the couch, it'd be easier to clean up. While Lacy lay in a pile of her own feces that had built up on the couch, the parents treated it as her simply being uncooperative, dealing with it with the mindset that if she doesn't want to get up, then let her stay there. As the rest of the house was clean, it was tidy, the entire house, except for the couch, except for Lacy. Years would go by like this. Lacy would remain on the couch, her parents would feed her when they felt obligated to do so, and Lacy would lie there the entire time. And with time, Lacy's clothes would no longer fit her, as she began to lose incredible amounts of weight as a result of malnourishment. Not to mention that Clay and Shayla would frequently leave Lacy alone for days on end, forgetting to feed her, as Lacy had essentially become immobile by this point because of so much time she'd spent malnourished and being in such a fixed position for so long. Her muscles stiffened and became atrophied, leaving her unable to move. And at this point, so much feces had built up that maggots began to arrive, which would begin to eat away at not only her waist, but at her as well. And at this point, Lacy had had enough. It was too much to bear. She had sores on her body which burst and were getting infected as a result of the waste. Her body hurt from the positioning of her limbs, and she was so malnourished that she was basically starving. There were signs that Lacy had tried to lift herself out of the couch, but at this point, from sitting down in that couch for so long, it essentially became a pit, and in her state, she didn't have the energy to lift herself out of it. She was stuck. More years would pass, and Lacy's body would eventually fuse to the leather couch cushions, stuck together by urine and feces. Her sores were open larger than before, so much so that the maggots that were once in the waist and in her hair made their way inside of her body, eating her from the inside. The aftermath. In the aftermath of such cruelty displayed to Lacy from her own parents, it would all culminate in a day roughly more than a decade after Lacy first sat down on the couch. It's January 3rd, 2022. Shayla, Lacy's mother, would dial 911 to report Lacy's dead body, whom her and her husband found on the couch after returning from one of their many trips. The same trips where they would leave Lacy for days, perhaps even weeks on end, to fend for herself in that awful state they themselves had become responsible for putting her in. The 911 operator, upon hearing that their daughter's heart had stopped beating and it appeared she was dead, the operator urged the parents to perform CPR on their daughter until dispatchers could arrive. According to the Fletcher's lawyer, they did allegedly perform CPR on Lacy, but there is no evidence that suggests whether they did or didn't. When emergency services and a coroner arrived at the home, the sight was awful. The entire house smelled horrible. It smelled as if you were to have walked into a septic tank, as described by the coroner named Dr. Ewell Bickman. Bickman said that by the time he had arrived to the scene, there were already officers, paramedics, and investigators all crowding this suburban home. When he looked around at the faces of everyone there, they all had this look of being in a daze, a look so disturbed from what they had seen inside.
When I got there, the officers, the first responders on scene were just in a daze. They were just standing there. They were on the outside. When I walked in, the house smelled of a stench of, it smelled like a sewer, a septic tank, and also a smell of death. I've never smelled that in my life.
When Bickman was inside of the home, he found Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher both inside, staring at their daughter's body. Mr. Fletcher, as Dr. Bickman described, had this emotionless look on his face, while the mother had her head between her legs, shedding a tear or two. During Dr. Bickman's news station interview, you can vividly see that Bickman is still incredibly shaken up by what he witnessed that day. Lacy weighed 96 pounds when she was found. It was determined that she had been dead for at least 1 to 2 days before Sheila had decided to call 911.
What do we not see? Because from the outside, the house looks beautifully appointed. The lawn is well cared for. The house is well cared for. It's diabolical that this is the scene inside.
Lacey's autopsy report stated that her cause of death was a result of multiple conditions. This included bone infection, prolonged immobility, malnutrition, and severe chronic neglect of a special needs individual. Her cause of death was listed as sepsis. A bit of backstory on the parents. Clay and Sheila Fletcher were both high school sweethearts who ended up getting married and ended up having Lacy. Clay worked for a local nuclear energy plant. Sheila had been a police and court clerk in Baker, and more recently, an assistant to the city prosecutor in Zachary. And when Lacy's body was reported to the authorities, they prepared themselves for the inevitable trial. And at this point, there was nothing really the Fletchers could do to defend themselves. I mean, it's pretty clear what happened, but they tried anyway. A big claim brought up by the Fletcher's lawyer was that they claimed that Lacy suffered from locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome is a rare neurological condition where a person is conscious and aware, but completely paralyzed, except for vertical eye movements and sometimes blinking. Individuals with this syndrome can think and reason, but cannot move or speak, leaving them effectively trapped within their own body. However, this claim would be disregarded as there was significant evidence showing that Lacy was trying to get out of the couch. She simply lacked the energy to do so because of her malnutrition and the freezing of her bones from being in that position for so long. Something else that disproves this claim was the contents of what was found inside of Lacy's stomach. After the autopsy was done, inside of her stomach, they found pieces of the couch cushion and feces.
Some type of like butterscotch or just candy, peppermint type candy. And that was it. That's the only nourishment she probably had, because I'll just be, not try to be too graphic, but in her stomach, she had the yellow foam from the sofa and feces. So you take it from there.
She'd literally been pulling at the foam of the sofa and eating it.
Correct.
The only two things that were in her reach in the state that she was in. And even if she did suffer from locked-in syndrome, she should have been taken to the hospital regardless, not left on the couch and treated as an inconvenience. The Fletchers were arrested in May 2022 and charged with second-degree murder. Sheila and Clay pleaded no contest in exchange for the charge being reduced to the lesser conviction of manslaughter. If convicted of second-degree murder, they would have faced a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The prosecution stated that their intention to seek the maximum manslaughter sentence of 40 years in prison in an attempt to achieve a de facto life sentence for Sheila and Clay. Reflecting on this entire case, the biggest question that seems to be floating around regarding Lacy's fate is the fact that why did nobody look for her? Church members were supporting the parents. There's footage. They wrote character letters for them, though others didn't even know they had a child. Because the Fletchers were pretty prominent in the church community, they would go every Sunday and mingle with the people there. In 2010, the Fletchers did end up going to Lacy's doctor without her, whom the last time that Lacy went to the doctor was back in 2002. So at this point, it was already 8 years later since she'd been to the doctor. The Fletchers told the doctor that Lacy was confined to the home, didn't want to eat, and didn't want to do anything. He advised them that they need to bring her in for her to be hospitalized. This never happened. It all comes back to the Fletchers. Evil would be an understatement to describe the actions of letting not even just your own daughter to suffer for a decade, but to do this to a human being is appalling, despicable, and flat out sinister. A pure lack of empathy. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this case is truly one that does haunt me. It's one I think about a lot, one that always makes me sick to my stomach whenever I come across it. So please, be kind, show compassion, check in on others, and lend a hand when you can, because you never know who might need it. And I do want to give a huge thank you to all of my channel members for making this video possible, and my ultimate tiers, Kareem Ariano, Alejandro from the Tower, and Crumster.